So who are the people who develop an organization's strategies and ensure they are carried out? The board. A gathering of diverse people who deeply care about the same thing, giving service to their community. What do the members of the board at San Benito say about how they work to keep San Benito Literacy Center moving forward?
Welcome to our special call board meeting, San Benito Literacy Center Board of Directors. Today is Tuesday. You know, the drudgery of being a board member sometimes, the month to month, kind of the nuts and bolts, we've asked them to be committed to that and be as team players and stick with us through good times and bad times. We're not looking for somebody who has the idea of coming to play board member once a month. We're looking for a more active board that can, as a group, we can make decisions that we've all decided on, that we can get behind, that they're actively involved, because we are a small committee, they're actively involved in helping us with our mission. Not only raise money, but promote our mission.
We know that the program and the services that we have are needed out in the community. It's just that sometimes the community doesn't get the notice for some reason, and I just want to make sure that we're working really good with the schools. That would probably be the best way.
To get, 10 individuals qualified for your program, you have to submit 30.
Right.
So we may have 30 contacts, submit those, and actually only 10 of those meet their guidelines. So, it's a numbers game at this point, and we just got to
at least get our numbers as high as they can, because the funding is tied to the numbers. Right. So depending on how many students we get is how much money we get.
We need to have 45 youth, and so far we only have maybe 25. So we need to start. I go to the board meetings, and because I'm here, I know what we need, how many students we have, and I go to the board and I tell them, okay, this and this is happening. We're going to need this, we're going to need that. I let them know exactly what is happening. I do the program side of it.
I think you have to develop some trust in those people that are doing your day-to-day operations. I think the board's focus should be on much stronger things like the mission, like the finances, like a long-term sustainability plan. How are you going to survive? How are the programs working? Those types of things. But I think the day-to-day operations, you have to have trust in someone. Of course, it's a developed trust, but you have to let go. And I think a lot of small boards have that issue.
We all want the same thing. The board, we're all in it for the same reason. You have to want for the Literacy Center to succeed in order to be on the board or here, or you have to want it. You want it that bad. You live it.
The next item on the agenda is consideration and action of new board members. You've all seen these folks.
I won't go into details, but we have had a couple of people on the board who tried to more or less take over the board and do things in a way which we did not feel was proper, and we didn't let it happen. You have to be to stick to your guns, so to speak.
We ask everybody to sort of check their ego at the door. They were chosen to be part of our board as for their knowledge, for their breadth of knowledge and being involved with the community. But we look for team players. We look for those individuals who have an interest in what we're doing, have an interest in making us successful, and they've been out in the community. They're not afraid to go talk to folks about our mission.
As you've seen, San Benito's board has been through its own positive transformation. It has always been of both necessity and choice an involved grassroots group of activists in their non-profit community, not just overseers of the realm. Here again, to shed more light on the ways to make the best board and bring out the best in your board is our own Barry Silverberg. So Barry, why does an organization need a board of directors at all?
Well, it really speaks to the basic core of what a nonprofit is. What differentiates a nonprofit from a for-profit is the fact that it exists for the public benefit. That's the purpose of the organization. The second difference relates to who controls the organization. And who controls the organization in a nonprofit is the board of directors, which is legally required. There's a minimum requirement of 3 members to a board of directors. The third thing is in terms of ownership of the organization. The ownership is by the public. And that ownership is then reflected by the fact that the attorney generals of the respective states oversee how nonprofits operate. So the basic key difference between a for-profit and a nonprofit is not that a nonprofit doesn't make money, because nonprofits can make profits. The key difference is in who owns the organization and what its purpose is. And therefore, the board of directors is basically playing the role and fulfills legal duties to represent the public.
So what are the responsibilities of board members? What are they getting in for here? What are they in for?
Well, the first thing I would point out are the duties of a board member that lead to their responsibilities. And under the law, and this is United States law, not just state law, the board members have 3 legal duties. The first is called the duty of care. And the duty of care basically says that every board member, when they sit on a board and make decisions as a board member, must do it as any reasonable person with the same information would do in a similar circumstance. And again, that feeds back to that these individuals are representing the public. They're not there.
But as opposed to what? I mean,
as opposed to operating out of self-interest. Okay? So the second legal duty, that's usually called the business judgment rule. And that's the same rule that applies, for example, to members of boards of trustees of corporations. The second legal duty is called the duty of loyalty. And the duty of loyalty says that when the organization, when somebody sits on a board and makes decisions as a board member, they're legally required not to have other sets of interests, or if they have other sets of interests, to declare them. So if I'm sitting on a board that's a coalition, and I'm representing Group A, then by definition I have a conflict of interest, because Group A may have a different set of needs. So if you have a literacy council, and everybody in the literacy councils comes from different organizations, then one of the issues you have is, for example, if people became aware of a grant opportunity, how do they use that information, which is a competitive situation. And so what you do in an organization, and what's absolutely critical, is to have what's called a conflict of interest policy. You establish a policy that defines what is a conflict of interest and how do you deal with it. And usually the person who has that conflict is asked not to participate in the deliberations.
Now, I assume that the policies about conflict of interest are things that get established early on in the formation of the board.
Right. And this is where, and these policies are not difficult to establish. There are copies available and people can copy them and so forth. The critical thing is the thinking process that goes on in the board, which deals with the values of the organization. Okay? The third, just to finish up, the third legal duty is called the duty of obedience. And the duty of obedience basically says that when you're making a decision, you need to make it based upon, well, you need to make it with the mission of the organization in mind. You can't decide to do something that's outside the mission of the organization. So, or I'm sorry, you can't do something that isn't true to the mission of the organization. Okay. So for example, when the Red Cross after 9/11 trauma chose to expend part of the money that was raised, or put part of the money aside for future traumas, they violated what the donors had expected would be the case when they gave their money.
Now, was that a violation of their legal duty?
That was a violation of legal duty, and while the American Red Cross is a very reputable, worthwhile cause, I'm not trying to speak negatively of the Red Cross, but what happened in that instance, and it's important for small organizations to be concerned about this as well, is that the Red Cross had set aside $100 and some odd thousand, or $100 some odd million, whatever the numbers were, and did not make that money available until the Attorney General of the state of New York threatened to sue the American Red Cross. And then the American Red Cross was forced to expend money to run ads in the New York Times and other major newspapers saying what their plan would be to distribute that money. So the money that was given by the donors was not used for the purposes they were given.
So now you said
that's a problem.
So the duties of the board are care, loyalty, and obedience.
Right.
And those lead to responsibilities?
And that then translates into what are the responsibilities of the board. And there are a lot of rubrics about what are the responsibilities of the board. The one I like to use, because I think it's the most logical, is moves from the general to the specific. The first set of responsibilities or role of the board is to set the organizational priorities. And we can talk about the elements separately, but basically it's the board that establishes the values, the vision, and the mission. Everything starts from the values. And that is the basis for any kind of strategic thinking or strategic planning.
Now, is the board free to invent whatever values or to impose whatever values it wishes, or is it in some way constrained by the original founding ideas of the organization?
Usually the values remained pretty constant, as does the vision of the organization. The mission often changes. The values are usually incorporated in a document called the Articles of Incorporation, which is a legal document that actually, at least in the state of Texas, establishes the organization. And that's separate from having the tax-exempt status that one would want in most nonprofits. One gets that from the Internal Revenue Service, which is obviously part of the federal government. And so, so the values and the vision are reflected in that document. That document can be amended, but it's usually not touched very often.
So now, okay, now we've talked a little bit about the duties and responsibilities. Any risks in being a board member?
Well, there are more duties and more responsibilities.
Okay.
But there are significant risks. Okay, if a board member doesn't fulfill one of its legal duties, then they could be civilly liable if the organization ends up expending funds in fashion that's illegal. The real focus needs to be on board members taking their responsibility seriously, rather than dealing with the issue of discipline and fear and so forth. What I found in my experience, and I've been involved in nonprofits for over 30 years, what I found in my experience is most boards are unaware of their legal duties and their responsibilities, and that many executive directors don't understand them. And people see their service on the volunteer board as a leisure time activity, and as such, are not sufficiently aware of the consequence and implication of their behavior. And so what we do in our Center for Community-Based and Nonprofit Organizations is help educate people, since that's the starting point.
Now, who is responsible for making sure that the board is well seized of its responsibilities and duties? Is that the executive director's job?
Well, the board itself is responsible, okay? Usually it's the executive director or a particularly sophisticated member of the board, okay? In terms of structure, in most cases, the board of directors is formed, hires the executive director. The executive director is the only employee of the organization hired by the board, and is the employee accountable to the board. The executive director then hires any additional staff. Now, this is really important in small organizations, because in small organizations, members of the board will often relate to staff members in ways that may appear as if they're supervising, or staff members may turn to board members to try to adjudicate a problem. And as we know from human relations, a triangulated relationship usually leads to disaster. And so boards need to be very clear on the authority and the responsibility of the executive director. And that should, I believe, actually be incorporated within the organization's bylaws.
It would seem, in the scenario you laid out, that would be something about the possibilities for mission creep, that you're on the board, absolutely, but then it kind of, so how do you avoid mission creep as a board member?
You avoid mission creep by talking about it. I mean, I believe very strongly that that often the case, and this has been written up in a lot of documentations, Harvard Business Review and other places, I characterize it in a very common, direct way. Too often, members of the board end up leaving their brains at the door before they walk into the boardroom. They wouldn't balance their personal checkbook the way they allow the finance of the organization to be conducted. And you see this in a lot of national organizations where there have been scandals. And we don't need to cite what those are. Okay? Scions of industry have sat on boards, nonprofit boards, where the directors have done some unethical, illegal, immoral activity. And so those board members didn't take their responsibility seriously. Another critical thing is for the board members to see themselves in the role of being a leader, and that their responsibilities help define the message of the organization. and to get it out there, which is another one of the board's responsibilities, which is ensuring that the organization has all the necessary resources.
Who picks board members? How does one become a member of the board?
Within a sophisticated operation, and so the motto I would throw out is where people ought to strive for.
Right.
This is not where most people are at, but where they ought to strive for. How you select board members should relate to what your purpose is and what your goals are, what your strategic thinking, planning are.
Who actually does it before we get to that?
Well, based upon that,
Okay.
the state-of-the-art thinking is you create a board governance committee.
Within the board?
A year-long committee made up of some board members, perhaps non-board members.
Okay.
And these folks basically look at how the board is operating, just like in any kind of personal relationship. It's important that somebody worry about the relationship. And the board governance committee is that entity that worries about the glue about how the organization operates. Now that should be a year-round process. It's not just like many boards. It's April, we need a board by June, let's go out and find a couple of live bodies. What happens there is often the situation of bait and switch. Is if those people are so eager to get people on their board, they'll allow them on the board or recruit them without laying out what should be high expectation and understanding of the responsibilities of being a board member. And so one needs to lay those out. So before one does that, one needs to understand that. This governance committee, then identifies what are we looking for? Do we need lawyers? Do we need accountants? What kind of racial diversity? What kind of gender diversity? What kind of generational diversity? Are the board members educable? Do we really want a board member who's going to be cantankerous? Okay. Too often boards think that they're going to invite in their opposition to the board and win them over. And instead they end up with a situation where the board process becomes dysfunctional. And that dysfunctionality is reflected in the fact that volunteers vote with their feet. So folks don't show up at the board meeting. And tons of organizations face that.
So it sounds like the board governance committee, a lot of what they do, the way they think is sort of cooking to get this ingredient that'll work with that ingredient and that member who has that mix of personalities.
Right.
It's mojo, it's voodoo sort of almost.
Well, it's not voodoo. I mean, actually, all of this is common sense. Because basically, my key argument I would make about boards, if people took the responsibility seriously and strove for excellence and credibility being that people believe what was actually happening in the process, then they wouldn't engage in voodoo. They would take the time and the due diligence, which is absolutely critical, to do the appropriate planning and thinking about who ought to be on this board. Very often, what we have are boards that are engaged in working in poor neighborhoods or working with disenfranchised folks, economically deprived, whatever words you want to use, and they're made up of largely middle-aged white guys. Okay, and so the people of color that are part of the service population aren't represented. Women aren't represented. Okay, and that's often the case in boards, and those prove to be very ineffective in the long term.
So I'm on the board governance committee, got my board out there. What does a really effective board look like? How does an effective board operate? How would I know that I'd gotten it right?
Number one, the most important thing to me is every single board member feels that every time they come to a board meeting, they have to be there because they make a difference. So everybody needs to feel valued. You get that through sense of common mission. You get that by how you run the meetings. People are not born with the skill to be a chairman of a committee. Okay? Matter of fact, studies show that being able to run meetings, just as an aside, is one of the most important qualifications for people to advance in the business community. So how things happen, okay, is critical. Number two, people need to understand what the organization is about. Again, if people don't go through a process of acculturation, socialization, there's no reason why they would know what the organization's history or mannerisms are. Number three, effective organizations have what are called ground rules. There are clear understandings about how they do business. When they start, how they disagree, the fact how they deal with each other, and they respect each other in the process. So An effective board is one in which people trust each other, in which the board does not focus on operations. Now I'm dealing with a mature board now.
Right.
Okay? They don't focus on operations, they focus on governance. They're concerned with the strategies, the values of the organization. They're concerned with the goals of the organization. They're engaged in policy setting and decision making. They don't operate as a committee of the whole and decide the programs.
But so what should be ideally the relationship between the board and the organization? Because I know you've talked about the dangers of kind of getting involved in the operation. It sounds almost like you're saying the board should be on high, but that's not what it shouldn't be.
But yes. The board should be, again, providing the three major responsibilities are to set the priorities of the organization, to provide oversight, which is financial, risk management, legal oversight, to make sure the organization is viable, operating within its legal constraints, and operating legally, and three, to ensure that the organization has the necessary resources. Members of the board might be engaged in the operations of the organization as volunteers. But as board members, okay, their primary responsibility is to have that overview of the organization. Now, in the case of San Benito, for example, San Benito is an organization which is very effective at the current time because of the engagement of its board in its activities. But it's really also an evolution. Ultimately, as that program grows, if that's their desire, the board will become disengaged from the day-to-day activities. The executive director would run and oversee those day-to-day activities, and the board would be more involved in the areas of promoting the organization in the way I mentioned before.
Well, are there signs that you can point to know, or you can identify to know that, okay, well, let me put it this way. At the beginning, you can imagine in a small organization, the board would be doing their board stuff,
Right.
and they're involved in doing other kinds of stuff. Now then, as the organization grows and moves, are there signs so you can tell that, okay, it's time for the board to kind of pull back from this operational stuff? How do you know? How do you think about that?
The way you deal with that is you engage in continuously strategic thinking. You step back on a periodic basis and you decide where it is you want to be at the end of a period of time. So, for example, the board would engage in a process, which is discussed by another of our panelists, on strategic thinking. And that process would tell you that in 2 years, you want to be at X place, okay? And what do you need to get there? Now, part of that is going to be recruiting resources from the community to make that happen. The board itself needs to let go of the day-to-day activities. Otherwise, other people don't feel like they can get involved in the organization.
So you're saying that, like, as soon as you are not, the board's operational input is not critical, they should stop doing it?
Well, as soon as the board is willing to let go, and it needs to be discussed, the board needs to discuss as part of its planning process, where do we want to be? If the board is doing the day-to-day stuff, then it's really, in essence, not taking the energy to recruit all those other people who could be involved, where this board could be involved in much larger issues and leading the organization to real greatness, because they'll be thinking on a different plane. It's the forest and trees analysis. The board ought to be concerned with the forest. The staff and the volunteers, the day-to-day volunteers, ought to be concerned with the trees. Somebody's got to be worrying about the forest. If you have a board that's engaged in operations, then their focus is not going to be on the trees. You can't possibly be engaged in both at the same time.
How do you know that your board is the right size? How do you know when you need to get somebody else? How do you know?
Yeah. Again, just like in architecture, structure should follow function. And so when one knows what one wants to achieve through the strategic planning process, then you can identify, okay, we want to raise $1 million. Well, what do we need to raise $1 million? For sure, we need some people on this board who have an idea of how to do that, okay? And so the size of the board should be a reflection of the kinds of expertise you need in order to carry out the functions of the organization. Now, a board should not be so large that people on the board feel they're not adding value. And a board should be made up of people who add something to the board, very specifically. A board should not be made up of folks who what's called the designer board, with designer names who who wouldn't know each other if they fell over each other, who don't come to board meetings. You want board members who come every board meeting and engage in the process of building the organization.
There are a good number of nonprofit organizations for whom the boards largely exist for funding.
Right.
That's what you want. You go get the board member
Right.
who will help you to,
Right.
and that's a real live
Right.
thing. And a lot of organizations desperately need that.
Right.
So how big a concern should the financial resources a board member brings be in the selection of a board member?
One of the key responsibilities of board members is ensuring the organization has the necessary resources, financial being critical. Okay? That doesn't mean that every board member needs to be, a major donor. It means every board member needs to participate in the process of getting donations and support for the organization. Fundraising is not about money. Fundraising is about relationships. And so what you want on a board are a group of people who can help establish relationships, create a credible organization that people will want to invest in. It's a mistake to think, I believe, or let me change it. It's short-term thinking to think. We put Mr. and Mrs. Moneybags on the board, and Mr. and Mrs. Moneybags is going to invite all their, Moneybagette friends to give to the organization. It doesn't work that way, okay? Just the way fundraising works, it doesn't work that way. The most important thing to an organization is credibility. And what we see today in today's environment as organizations are facing financial crunches, it's not only because of poor fundraising. Poor fundraising is a symptom of the fact that many organizations do not have strong boards, do not have strong networks in the community. Now, clearly in the case of San Benito, they have a strong network. They've built up a strong network. That network, however, again, talking in terms of evolution, long term, appears to depend upon a limited number of individuals, which is good right now. But an organization is an institution, not just the lengthened shadow of an individual. And so one needs to be concerned about what happens if, God forbid, those individuals pass from the scene, either because they get angry or nature takes its course, whatever it may be. So one needs to institutionalize, one needs to create structures, one needs to create processes. And that's very often in nonprofits. They're so busy dealing with what they consider the plot and blind that they're not thinking about tomorrow.
Board members for nonprofit organizations volunteer.
Right.
So can they be thought of as another class of volunteer to the extent that you need to make sure that they have a satisfying experience, that they're happy? Do you have to hold hands for your board members?
I wouldn't say hold hands, okay? I believe in partnership, okay? My own belief and experience is a strong executive and a strong board. Then there being a creative tension between those. And out of that creative tension comes deep respect. And so one is able to fulfill one's role by asking tough questions. You don't want a bunch of pansies on the board, and you don't want a pansy as a board as a director. You want somebody who's going to be strong and know what they stand for, okay? And now, in that process comes the strength of the organization. It's not just based upon the individuals, it's also based upon these processes that exist.
But so the strength of an organization, you talk about the creative tension though, if you have strong personalities on the board and you got a strong executive director, there's, at a certain point, that tension is great, at a certain point it's not, and that's again, isn't that a matter of art or is that a function of the structure of the board executive director relationship?
Again, one establishes these ground rules, these procedures and processes and understandings. For example, without going through all the ground rules, one of the ground rules would be mutual respect. Okay? A second ground rule would be discuss undiscussable issues. One of the key problems in nonprofits, because of the lack of sufficient leadership in most nonprofits, is what I call the emperor's new clothes syndrome, the 900-pound gorilla, okay? The open secret, the hidden agenda. And what happens in the meetings and in the organization is everybody knows there's a problem. Nobody has the courage, and courage is a very important element on being a board member, okay? Nobody has the courage to address that issue. So you start making decisions, everybody knows about it, and you start making decisions around that issue. Those are bad decisions. The best decisions are direct, deal with the direct issue. You start, again, triangulating. And then the credibility of the board goes down because everybody knows they're living to some extent a disingenuous experience as a board. And so what I would argue for in terms of the role of board members is to play the role of that child in the emperor's new clothes. And when the emperor is naked, to say the emperor is naked. When the executive director is not doing their job, you say they're not doing their job. If the board president's not doing their job, you say it. If a board member's not doing their job, you say it. Because you've agreed that you want a credible organization.
So you've dealt with and seen many boards in action in Texas and elsewhere over the last number of years. Is there one bit of advice, if you had to give a bit of advice to ameliorate, to address a concern you've had among boards all over the joint, what might that bit of advice be?
Take your job seriously, be honest, be credible, be leader. I think that those have integrity. I think nonprofits in particular right now, in this day and age, are facing a crisis. The crisis is one of credibility. The public doesn't believe in the integrity of nonprofit organizations in general. All the studies show that. And that's partly because nonprofits haven't been credible. And so one of the things we're about is helping individuals actualize their potential, both in terms of our clients, those who receive the services, and those who participate. And so we should not be living lies, and we should speak about truth with a capital T, not in a religious, spiritual sense, but when something's not right, we need to speak up and resolve it. And that, to me, is the power of the nonprofit sector. That's our charge and responsibility.
When we think about honesty and integrity and credibility, we think Barry Silverberg. Thank you so much, Mr.
Thank you, Aaron.
Appreciate your wisdom.
Thank you.